Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to the shop. Today I want to talk about the difference between regular bench chisels and mortising chisels, or pig stickers. They are a fun tool that is more or less designed for creating mortises, but how about a bench chisel? Can you create a mortise with a bench chisel? Let's dive in and take a look. So first off, what's the big difference between a traditional bench chisel and a mortising chisel? They both are basically the same thing in that they're a chisel. They're a point where two surfaces of metal come together to just barely touch. And because of that, you have a sharp edge here, just like with a bench, you have a sharp edge right here. So both of them can do the similar work. Whatever you do with a bench chisel, you can do with a mortising chisel. Whatever you do with a mortising chisel, you can do with a bench chisel. They'll both function the same way. The big differences are in how they function. With a bench chisel, the tang is much, much thinner, so you don't see a lot of material in here. And that can lead to a little bit of vibration if you're really pounding on this. Whereas with a mortising chisel, you can see this is really, really thick. I mean, it is taller than the width of the blade itself. This is a 1/4 inch chisel, but it's almost 3/4 of an inch tall here. So when I drive into this, I'm going to have a lot more force. This is going to be a very sturdy thing. It's not going to vibrate in the cut. And that makes it feel a lot better. Another slight problem with the normal bench chisel is if I put it into a mortise and I try to lever out the chips, there's a tendency to try and twist more, and you could easily bend the chisel or break it. And that is it's a bad thing to do. Whereas with a mortising chisel, levering out the chips, there's pretty much no way I could bend this. This is so thick that the amount of force I'd have to put on to bend or break this shank would just be incredible. You are going to get people from both camps that say the only chisel you should use when cutting a mortise is a mortising chisel. It's designed for that, so use the tool that's designed for the job you want to do. And there are other people who say, no, a bench chisel will still cut a mortise. There's really no reason to have more than one tool, so why not just cut it with a mortise chisel? And there are prominent people in both categories. Paul Sellers, for one, he basically just uses bench chisels and does them to great effect. And if you've known anything about Paul Sellers, there aren't too many more masters in the craft than him. And so if he says that's good enough, it's good enough. But then you'll come across others that say, no, a mortising chisel is a traditional tool designed for cutting mortises. This is what it's designed to do. So why not use a tool for the work in the work it's intended to be used? Both arguments have their merit, but neither argument is right and neither argument is wrong. If you don't have the money to get a mortising chisel, then just use your bench chisels. If you have some extra money lying around and you find a good deal on some mortising chisels, then get a good mortising chisel. Now when you go to buy bench chisels, I usually tell people get a set of bench chisels. This is a round 1/4 inch, I think it's 3 millimeters actually, up to 1 inch, which is actually a 24 millimeter. I use millimeter chisels. It really doesn't matter if they're standard or millimeter because I'm going to be cutting something to fit something else. The shape and size of the cut I'm making generally doesn't matter. I can always adjust to fit with one of these chisels. Now, when it comes to mortising chisels, on the other hand, I usually tell people only buy them one at a time. Rarely do you need a full set of mortising chisels from 1/8 inch up to 1 inch or whatever. I have a 1/4 inch mortising chisel and I have an 1/8 inch mortising chisel. I don't have a 1/2 inch because I rarely need to make 1/2 inch. And usually I say a 1/4 inch is pretty much all you're going to need. Most mortises out there are a 1/4 inch. If you're working with 3/4 inch material, a 1/4 inch mortising chisel is all you need, or an 1/8 inch mortising chisel. It doesn't really matter what size, as long as it's something around that range. If you're going to get another one, then you may want to get a 1/2 inch if you're doing some larger material, but I rarely need anything that large. So when buying mortising chisels, just buy one at a time. Do not buy a full set of mortising chisels. You're just going to be wasting your time on a couple chisels that you may never use. So let's actually get into their function. Normally what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the chisel that I want to use to cut my mortise, and I'm going to use it and mark out on either side the width of the chisel. Once I put a mark on here, then I can set up my mortising gauge to those marks and lay out my mortising gauge to whatever size I have. That's why I say it really doesn't matter if you're going to be using standard or metric, because you can always adjust the cut to fit whatever mortising chisel you have or whatever bench chisel you have. So now I've set this up where my lines are right on there, and these two lines I know are exactly the same width as my chisel. So when I cut in here, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, I'm always going to be getting the right cut. And the same thing works with a bench chisel as opposed to a mortising chisel. I would just set that on here and do the same thing to lay out the lines on that. Grab a mortising gauge and set these up to match those new lines, and away we go. Now I have a mortising gauge set up to match this chisel. So let's get into some of the actual functional differences between them. With a standard bench chisel, it's going to dive in a good ways. Then I can progress it back in the direction of the bevel, and each time I'm just going to go down a little bit deeper, and a little bit deeper, and a little bit deeper until I'm down at the depth that I'm looking for. It works really well. With a mortising chisel, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Set it in, go down to depth, and with this I just feel like there's a little bit more force into it, and I have no problem actually putting them a little bit farther apart. With the bench chisel, I tend to put them about a 1/16 of an inch apart in my cuts, whereas with this one I put them a little farther away, almost up to 1/8 of an inch. I want to be careful of that in some hardwoods. I don't want to be splitting off more than I need and just get aggressive for the sake of being aggressive. But I find that the mortising chisel progresses just a little bit faster than the bench chisel, but that's more or less a personal difference. The big difference comes when it's time to lever out the chips. So I can get this in here, and with a regular bench chisel, I need to be very, very careful that I don't put too much pressure on it. Otherwise, I'll bend the shank when I bend out the chips. With a mortising chisel, I don't have to worry about that too much. There's enough strength in this that if I lever out the chips, it's going to go very, very quickly, and I don't have to worry about bending the shaft because it's thick enough. Once I get that down in there a ways, I can really use this as a lever to clean out the bottom of the mortise. One of the things you do have to be careful of is because this is so much thicker, there's a tendency to actually cut this at a narrower point. And I've seen some of these mortising chisels where the tip of this is at 20 or even as little as 15 degrees. A very, very sharp point. The nice thing about that is when I drive it down in, that thing will dive immediately and become a very, very efficient cutter. But with it being so thin, if I want to lever anything out, I'm probably going to run the risk of breaking the tip off on the chisel. With a bench chisel, because it's so thin, you generally don't have anything steeper than 25 degrees. Sometimes they're even at like 30 or 35 degrees. Actually, I sharpen mine at somewhere around 30 degrees. So I don't worry as much about breaking off the tip. But again, I'm going to be worrying about levering because I don't want to actually bend the shank on this. So what angle should you actually sharpen your mortising chisel to? Usually I like to sharpen them to somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees. Fairly similar to my bench chisel, that angle just works pretty well. But everyone's going to tell you something a little different, so find the angle that works for you. Another problem that often comes up with mortising chisels is that they tend to be very narrow chisels, particularly due to their length. And that causes a lot of people to either have them with a bit of a taper on there so that the tip of the chisel is skewed, or it causes them to be a bit warped in the way they're cutting. Some people like to put a compound angle on here, and that they will have a main angle of like 30 degrees, and the last little bit they'll just sharpen that at 25 degrees. So the last bit of sharpening, they lift up the heel and sharpen that down. I like to do it in just one go, put it on the diamond plates, set it at an angle, find that angle, grind it down, grind it down, grind it down, clean it off, and then take it over to the strop. And that's about all I do for my chisel. If you find yourself skewing one way or the other, that's usually because you're putting too much pressure on it. So if I have a point developing on this side here, and this side is working back, I want to think about putting more pressure on this side of the chisel, almost thinking about pushing it down this way. And that will cause me to grind off more material on the side that it's sticking out. So just think about putting more pressure on one side of the chisel or the other. Most people tend to have a problem with putting too much pressure on one side, usually the side away from them, and that will cause you to grind more on that side over time. So you just want to think about putting more pressure on the side you want to take more off and grind it down. With a good mortising chisel, on average 1/4 inch mortises, I'm probably only going to sharpen it every 3 or 4 mortises, but just with that it's like 10-15 strokes each, and then 30 or so strokes on the strop, and I'm good to go. I really don't take that much more time in sharpening this than that 1, 2, 3 strop, and I'm good to go as long as I haven't chipped it or done anything with a damage to the tip. And surprisingly enough, that is the exact same way I sharpen my bench chisels. Put them on here, 1, 2, 3 strop, and we're good to go. They really don't take that much work. As long as you keep on top of them and you haven't rubbed them in too much or dulled the tip out too much, it's a very, very quick process and you're back to going. Don't worry about the secondary bevel, just sharpen them and go. Another fun use for a mortising chisel is if you ever need to create a groove, having that longer sole on the mortising chisel is actually really nice for freehand cutting grooves. Just start them in and you can actually cut in a groove really nice and quickly, just freehand with a mortising chisel. And this is actually a really fun technique once you get it down. Very enjoyable and very quick. You don't have to set up anything, you just go to town. So anytime you're doing like a stopped groove or dado, grabbing a mortising chisel makes it a really quick work, And especially with that longer sole on here, it makes it far easier to control. So you're not going to be diving in or out or sliding it easily. You can actually just ride it right along that long bevel. Now the next question everyone gets me is, where do you buy mortising chisels? And there are a few places you can buy them online. I'll actually leave a link to one down below. And you can buy them. Usually they come in sets, and so you're spending a lot more money buying other chisels that you may or may not use. The way I like to buy them is at tool meets and tool suppliers. And if you would like to find one around you, I have a website set up to help you with that, handtoolfinder.com. I'll leave a link to that down below as well. It is a site where I actually have a map set up of all the places I know of around the entire world to buy hand tools. If you find something that's not on that map, please let me know. I will add it to it, as well as antique stores that are devoted to hand tools, tool meets, and other things around the world. And then if that's still not enough, I have a list of several dozen online sellers that are reputable that devote themselves to selling antique tools. And anytime I'm looking for some particular tool, I go through one or two of their websites, or I'll contact one of them and say, hey, I'm looking for this particular part. Can you help me out with that? And then on top of all that, if you still can't find it, there is a listing of all of the collecting associations I know of. So these are groups of people who devote their time to collecting antique hand tools and can sometimes be the greatest resources you can ever come across in finding and knowing more about your hand tools. So definitely take a look at that website. A phenomenal amount of information on there. So I do have to say, if you like videos like this and you would like to actually see more about me talking and actually demonstrating the tools, I'm going to be moving most of these talking videos over to the second channel, Wood by Wright 2, and that is where all of the talking and instructional videos are going to be. And this channel is going to be more dedicated to the fun-loving music background, just general build videos. If you want to watch both, great, but a lot of people just like watching one type or the other. I'll separate them too, so it makes it a little bit easier for some people. So that will probably be happening in the next month or two, where I will completely separate the two channels, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, that's about it. Mortising chisels versus bench chisels. There really is no right or wrong. If I'm doing a mortise and I have the 1/4" chisel on hand, I'm probably going to use a mortising chisel because I generally prefer it a little bit more. But for the longest time, I just had a bunch of bench chisels because I didn't want to spend the money on mortising chisels. Bench chisels work just as fine. This is more one of those feeling things. If you like the feel of a tool and you are in it for that beautiful feeling of a nice curl and everything's happy, then get a mortising chisel because they do feel better. But a bench chisel is going to do the same work. Everyone's a little different. There is no right or wrong in the work as long as you are being safe, have fun, and enjoy your shop. So I think that's about it for today. I hope you like this bit of information. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If there's something particular you have or any information you'd like to leave, let me know down below. Also, if you can share and like and subscribe to the channel, that really does help out. Thanks so much, and until next time, have a wonderful day. Okay, it's time to start an argument. What's the difference between a mortising chisel and a pig sticker?